Cabbages and Kings, where we talk about game design and things. My name is Alex Neyman. I'm the host of the show. I'm here joined by John Hodgson, a good friend of mine. Both of us are game designers. I worked at Blizzard and at Counterplay Games. I've been working in game design for the approximately last 8 years or so, but I've always had a great passion for all types of games, including things like Dungeons and Dragons, which is actually what we're talking about today. But before we get to that, I want to allow John to introduce himself. Go ahead, John.
So, like Alex said, I've been a game designer for about 10 years. And I worked with Alex at Blizzard. And after that, I worked at a little studio called Squanch Games. And now I'm at Respawn Entertainment. I, too, have been dabbling in Dungeons and Dragons, although not necessarily to the level that Alex has. In fact, he introduced me to the game in a real playing setting. So I've been learning a lot, and I'm coming at it from an angle of, I didn't grow up with it, and that really has changed. That makes me bring a different perspective to the game.
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. We're both working at Blizzard at the time, and obviously we all worked on games professionally, like that was our occupation. But we also, there's a bunch of nerds, it turns out, that works at Blizzard. We all kind of like different things. But I was asking around the office, and there was a group of people that had never played D&D before, and I was like, well, we gotta fix this, because one of my favorite things is to introduce new people to Dungeons and Dragons. I think it's a really great. It's a great game, but not just Dungeons and Dragons, but role playing in general is like a unique, I think, aspect, a unique take on it, unique take on games, especially for someone that has a ton of history with video games to begin with, and they go to it. So I got a bunch of the people in the office. The majority had never played before, and we decided to make a group. And actually, the adventure that in the campaign that I decided to run was this thing called Zeitgeist. And that's what I want to talk about today is just kind of talk about that campaign setting and that adventure path a little bit, and kind of go from there and just kind of examine the game design kind of that goes into it and kind of break down what we think are interesting topics. I'd like to start with one of the things that I found the most interesting, like as I guess from a game design perspective, but just as a dungeon master as well, is like there's certain limitations that have been imposed on players that are different than the regular D&D world. Notably, there are limitations on flight. They're not allowed to fly over land or over more than like a minute or two at a time, which affects a lot of sort of the campaign world breaking, quote unquote, world breaking, super powerful versions of flight that occur, as well as like things like teleportation, the planar travel, which is sort of the planar travel is actually kind of at the crux of what the adventure path explores, like even from the very beginning. So John, how do you feel about the limitations on like flights and like teleportation in particular?
Looking at the limitations was freeing in a way.
Yeah.
Especially as a DM. So the one way to look at this is, okay, now DMs don't have to worry about filling in encounters and stories if players can teleport and fly, which really does sort of break the quote unquote level design of the encounter, the story that you're trying to tell, right? They're supposed to go meet these particular people and have these particular fights and presumably maybe take one of N number of paths through the dungeon where those would completely tear it out. And there's also, I gather, sort of a feeling of like, oh, if I could just fly over this, right? That's not necessarily an interesting way to skip an encounter. Like one of the cool things about D&D is that you can potentially get around these things, but it really forces players like myself to come up with a different way of like, well, okay, we can't fly over it or teleport over. That's the lazy way of just gaming this system. So we actually have to interact with the world in an interesting way in order to solve this particular problem.
Yeah, and there's it seems like a general theme of the adventure too that I think is very interesting is that it sort of really grounds you as players. Like, you're not adventurers, you are government employees, like right from the get-go. And there's a common theme throughout all of these things that happen with like teleportation, planar travel, and flight, is that I feel like it's almost more relatable in that, like, okay, I'm an investigator, I'm trying to figure out what's going on. Well, I can't just it isn't always so easy as like I I snap my fingers and I have a solution for this with magic or with magic items, or it's a little more complicated with that. But at the same time, it isn't. The reason I feel like it's justified is obviously any DM can say, I'm going to remove all the flying spells from the game. I'm going to remove teleportation from the game. But I think why this is so successful is that a lot of the limitations, which we can get back to limitations in a second, because they're actually an important part of game design, I think. But they build them into the world itself. And actually, like, every time a player interacts with this restriction, they're actually uncovering a little bit about the world that exists. And that it's like, okay, I think an ingenious little small thing that has so much mileage in this campaign and the stories in the campaign is, okay, loops of gold prohibit teleportation travel. And you learn that from the get-go. That's in the player's handbook. It's just like, oh, and so everybody, it's kind of common knowledge is like people actually hide gold rings in their toes so they can't be like manipulated with teleportation. But from the beginning of the adventure to like throughout, it recurs all the time is like this concept of like gold and what does gold mean, and gold loops in particular, like how are they important? And then I feel like the players feel so smart when they're like, I'm rewarded for learning about the world because it has like gameplay impact on certain things. And there's like a comment, like they feel smart because they're like, oh, I get it. Like, I understand, like this is a smart thing that kind of occurs.
It's almost as if, right? I don't know the writers, but it's almost as if the writers have had these same frustrations with gameplay surrounding things like teleportation and flying. And they're like, okay, well, we don't want those in this campaign. Oh, actually, it would be really interesting if there's reason why in this world. And they built an entire world around some of these limitations. And as a game designer, sometimes those these limitations can be like wellsprings of ideas.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about, I mean, we're going to get a little bit into spoiling the campaign a bit, right? But they could be as benign as a character in the early game that you encounter that does have the power of flight, right? And she's a bit of a mystical character because of that. People fear her. People are trying to hunt her down because of this, right? And it provides a hook for you to have an adventure. And then on the grander scale, speaking more in terms of the teleportation and the planar travel, like you said, Alex, like this is incorporated into why this world is different from other settings, and that the core plot of sort of the antagonist of the group is to essentially unlock the planar travel needed to remake the world in their image.
Yeah, it almost feels like, and it's a common theme, which I think is so powerful if you can keep consistent themes in a campaign world in general, or a campaign story that you're trying to tell. Because it kind of always goes back as like you're investigators, you're discovering uncovering mysteries and things like that. And honestly, the core of the campaign, if I had to describe it, there's a conspiracy. You're trying to figure out what's going on. That's not a huge spoiler. Kind of, it's in the blurb there to begin with. But the point is, everybody's trying to understand why the world is the way it is and why things work the way they do, and then like what power that then gives people. Like, and so it's interesting because your players are trying to uncover this stuff. Sorry, your characters are trying to uncover this type of thing, trying to understand what's going on. But as players, you're also trying to do that because if I know that gold loops do something, like the first time one of my players, something would have happened, but they had a gold ring on and it stopped it, that blew their mind to them. Like, that was a cool moment. That's like, oh, I was actually rewarded as a player for knowing something. Yeah, it's almost, do you feel like maybe when players, and this is in video games and also in D&D, like I think Dark Souls is a good example. Do you feel like players almost actually end up getting more of the lore when they have to go seek it out as opposed to it being presented to them? Because like Dark Souls, they don't tell you anything about what's going on really at all. But Absolutely. Through the items and also just like literally looking at the world you're around and experiencing it, I almost feel like I ended up getting more out of that world just because I had to go seek it out. In a way,
I completely agree. Like, even Dark Souls is a great example of, I don't need to know anything about this world. It's just everything that is in there wants to kill me, and I don't want to die. So like, I'm just going to start hitting things with swords. But every time you take a moment to pause and reflect on what's actually happening, you get a little bit more of that backstory. Even the story, like I think Dark Souls games are, I mean, there's a reason why you've got these YouTubers out there that are constantly opining about the lore and the story of what's happening. It's because it's what you put into it. Their experience of, okay, this door was locked when I came by it must mean that whatever group or society was on one side of that door was at odds with another group on the other side of society, or on the other side of that door, right? Is one possible interpretation, right? Mm-hmm. Or, you know, it could be my interpretation is somebody just lost the key. So it's kind of feeding into what you're saying of, do I want to engage with this? All I need is that initial one line of, here's why the goblins are here. Here's why the doctors are causing trouble. I don't need a entire backstory, and neither do I need like sort of the absence of that.
How did you feel, or how do you feel about the conspiracy, like the pros and cons maybe of having a conspiracy that exists, a large conspiracy that's central to like a campaign that existed here in the Zeitgeist?
Just the volume of conspiracy and the very nature of conspiracy being secrets and feints within feints within feints is almost a lot to take in as a DM. And so if I want to make things make sense, and I'm trying to tell players, oh, this is going to make sense, this is going to make sense, you need to apply your not only your meaning making as a player in the game to what the overall story is, but also as a character who's an investigator who's trying to run all of these like CSI type montages in order to find out what the thing, where they need to go next, or who is the bad guy. They're going to pick up on things that don't make sense. They're going to pick up on things that maybe I'm like I want to give them in order to justify the things that they're discovering without I'm not explaining this correctly, without doing damage to the overall story. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, I totally like you don't want to make a concession of, you obviously you want to give your players a bone, because the whole story is a investigation.
Exactly.
So you want to give them bones, you want to give them little pieces, but you're also at the same time afraid of, am I giving too much away? Am I giving away something that is at conflict with something that occurs later on in the later adventures?
Everything that I do and say, I have to catch up with later. And I think that trying to fit it within this lattice structure of the conspiracy is really difficult. That's the
totally
thing where the railroading doesn't actually help me.
I just thought there were a bunch of really small things really interesting with the way this adventure was designed that you had brought up in the past. I thought was really cool, of the things that sort of break the norm for what you'd expect from a D&D group. One that you brought up that I think is really cool is there's a sense of the B team. And so you're a member of this, this government organization. And obviously there are other people that are part of that. And at one point during one of these adventures, you actually start kind of cutting to what amounts to there's like a camera swipe that happens, and you go to the B team. You're all given, it's like a pre-generated characters. They're all given. There are all these other guys that are junior members of the REC, and your job is to kind of play them. And then you play them for a while, and then you cut back to your group. And like eventually these two things, like you're kind of simultaneously running two different groups of characters.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of this idea because the phenomenon that I've noticed is that players tend to put a lot of themselves in the characters. And for a campaign like this, where you're asked to inhabit the world in a very particular kind of role, like literally role playing for a while, there is, I think there's a tendency that things become pretty rote and pretty like, oh, is this character like reflecting me as a player correctly? Am I safe in putting myself out there and like doing things that I want to make sure that everybody knows this is my character doing things and not me.
And also,
things like that. Like,
do you think you can pull off that character, right? Maybe you have ideas for other stuff, but it also, you don't feel comfortable that I could pull off the flamboyant bard or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's such a thing as like just getting involved in the character in such a way that like maybe the way that you feel safe playing that character is by being really good at combat and power gaming and or like fading to the background, not saying anything, not engaging too much in the dialogue or the story. The B team has shaken up the campaign that I was in when I was playing with you. Myself and in particular one of the players that I was one of my fellow party members who is brand new also to D&D, played with a B team character, and then the B team character was basically a blank slate and said, well, this is their name and this is their class, and I think maybe there was like a short description of what
I think it had like a brief personality thing a little bit, but not a lot.
Right, but not even our my fellow party member really obeyed that, but they took it to the next level. They're like, oh wow, I'm no longer myself, but the character that I've built, I'm now this other character. I could do whatever I could really play this up. I could be somebody who's unlike me. I can role play. It
kind of goes back to the whole thing we talked before of like setting boundaries of you set one specific thing at the start and then it almost encourages creativity from that point forward.
Exactly.
It's like, okay, well now you are a cavalier, a like knight in shining armor style guy that's super charismatic. Go with it. Like you have to figure it out. And there's also something to be said.
A safe place for the player to go.
Because
you set when you set the rules and the expectations, they're like, cool. Like I don't have to do any of that stuff. I could just play this character the way that you're telling me to. This is a cavalier and a knight in shining armor. And okay, what do I imagine that being? Well, they're like super bombastic and they're charging headlong into long. I have a Don Quixote style idea of what this character is supposed to be, so I'm just gonna run forward with that. And that was super freeing in my experience, and I'm sure in my fellow party members' experience. And this idea of the B team made that safe to happen. It also really does it really opens up the world too. One thing that I felt was also a problem with the conspiracy game, and I don't know if you felt this way also, Alex, was why is all this stuff happening to me?
Yeah.
And avoiding some sort of bullshit chosen one narrative with I'm supposed to be in all of the right places all the right time. Introducing another character that you control, that's also encountering things that is in this world that's large enough to encompass more than just players go to a location and epic world-changing events happen. Right now, there's another group of players that are also engaged with that. Did that?
No, totally.
I understand with that.
I think there's a common theme with the way the campaign adventures were written, and that it almost has like a TV show style episodic feel. And in this one in particular, what this feels like is, this is the one episode where they cut to something of like a bunch of side characters, like the Star Trek episode where they go focus on a bunch of side characters and they leave, like Worf and Picard on their own for a while. And you're just like, who is this guy that's talking to people about, so that's sort of the feeling you get. But in the same way, that Star Trek episode has value because it puts a different lens again on the same world that you're seeing, that it actually makes you appreciate when you come back to the primary lens again. It actually is almost refreshing. You're like, from a role-playing perspective, it's actually, I think, very liberating. And what we noticed was our friend that was like sort of more quiet and didn't do a ton of role-playing. He did some, but he wasn't doing it all the time. I think it actually freed him up to be like, oh, well, wait, it kind of allowed him to sort of get out of his box for a second and do something that was an excuse of you don't have to play this very long. You should feel free to take risks. You should do whatever you want. Here's what you have to do. Then it's like, well, I'm just role playing because I have to, because this is what was given to me. This wasn't a choice. Then when he got back to his regular character, I think it helped him free up a little bit. All the group, it actually kind of shook up the gunk in the room of the role playing of people kind of get settled into people start seeing like John is his dwarven eschatologist and this Leo Danger is that player, right? Like all these people are this stuff, and it kind of like shook that up a little bit, that I think was refreshing and cool. But like you said, it also just lets you see the world in a different way, which was kind of neat. And also kind of really, it I think was cool because it fleshed out the RHC. Is you realized the RHC and the government that I'm a part of is more than just me. It's a bunch of people. And therefore now when I'm walking around the office and sitting there drinking my coffee in the morning, investigating this conspiracy, like that guy over there at the coffee machine, I played him. He was a real guy. He actually is a cool, interesting person, which I think is unique. So yeah, I know that the two of us have had a blast playing, and well, I haven't got into playing it, but I've run this thing twice. You've played in it and run it once. I think it's a travesty that it wasn't more popular than what it was. So if anyone's out there and you're interested in checking it out, I would go check it out. You go to, I think it's ENPublishing, or just look for like Zeitgeist EN You'll in Google, it'll pop up. It's cool. This isn't designed to be like an endorsement or a review, but at the very least, I think it's a really interesting read. And there's a lot, like, even like as a game designer, which is sort of what we're sort of talking about here, there's a lot of really interesting decisions that happen here. And I think a lot of this came together in a really cool, unique way that I even just reading through it, I have to kind of like, I think I examine as to why and what I'm doing as a dungeon master in general, which is a really cool way to do. Dungeon mastering is basically game design on a really micro level. Like that's really what it is you're creating gameplay experiences for 4 or 5 of your friends, and all of you together, storytelling in an interesting collaborative way. So I love D&D. I love Zeitgeist in particular. It's been a great experience for me. And I know that you've had a lot of fun with it too, John. So thanks for coming out and talking with me. Thanks for being a part of Cabbages and Kings. And hopefully we can do some more of these, get you out some more and talk about all sorts of other games. 'Cause I know that you and I love a lot of different games.
If I didn't have games, then I mean, I don't know what I would do. I certainly I wouldn't have anything to talk about with any level of intelligence.
We would be boring people, I'm sure. All right. Well, that's it for Cabbages and Kings. Thanks everyone for watching. See you all next time.